at the edge of the old world, before Egypt raises its first pyramid, before Sumer writes its first city names into clay, before kings learn to turn grain into taxes and temples into power, there are stones standing in the dust of southeastern Anatolia, carved with animals that seem to move in silence. Foxes, boars, snakes, vultures, cranes, and strange human-like forms stare out from limestone pillars shaped like enormous bodies without faces. They belong to a time so early that the usual language of civilization begins to fail. There are no pharaohs here, no palaces, no armies, no writing, no bronze weapons, no royal tombs glittering with gold. And yet someone has gathered people, fed them, organized them, taught them where to quarry stone, how to shape it, how to drag it across a hill, how to raise it upright, and how to fill a sacred enclosure with images powerful enough to survive almost 12,000 years. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes this forgotten world so unsettling is not that it proves the existence of some lost empire in the modern fantasy sense. It does not. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how these sites were used, who built them, and what kind of society could have supported them. But what survives in the record suggests something more interesting than legend. A deep prehistoric network of communities capable of memory, ritual, cooperation, symbolism, and construction on a scale that once seemed impossible before agriculture and cities. The story begins not in Egypt's Nile Valley, but farther north and east, in the lands between the Taurus Mountains, the upper Euphrates, the plains of northern Mesopotamia, and the stony highlands where wild wheat and barley once grew naturally. This is a landscape that does not look like the familiar birthplace of civilization if one expects straight canals, mud brick walls, and royal inscriptions. It is rougher, older, and more difficult to read. In the late Ice Age and the centuries after it, people here live by hunting gazelle and wild cattle, gathering seeds and nuts, moving through seasonal territories and returning to places that matter. They are not primitive in the careless sense that word is often used. They know the migrations of animals, the ripening times of plants, the dangers of drought, the habits of stone, the paths through hills, and the invisible weight of tradition. For much of the 20th century, the standard story was simple. First came farming, farming produced surplus, surplus produced villages, villages produced specialization, specialization produced temples, elites, and civilization. It was a tidy ladder, and like many tidy ladders in history, it was partly useful and partly misleading. Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, Chayonu, and other early sites complicate that order. They suggest that large-scale ritual gathering and symbolic architecture may not have waited politely for farming to arrive. In some places, belief, feasting, social alliance, and shared memory may have helped push communities towards settlement and cultivation, rather than the other way around. This does not mean there was a single forgotten super-civilization ruling the ancient world before Egypt. That idea belongs more to speculation than evidence, but it does mean there was a cultural horizon, a broad and astonishing world of related communities whose achievements forced the beginning of civilization backward into a stranger and more human place. The builders of these sites did not leave their names. They left stone bodies, buried buildings, polished floors, carved animals, skulls treated with care and traces of meal shared by many hands. They left the outline of a society that was not yet a state but was no longer easy to call simple. The mystery is sharpened by absence. Egypt announces itself with monuments and texts, with dynasties and calendars, with rulers who insist on being remembered. Sumer gives us tablets, temple accounts, myths, laws, and arguments over beer. But this older world speaks without writing. Its record is broken, burned, buried, and weathered. Archaeologists must listen to soil layers, bones, seeds, stone tools, post holes, wall plaster, pigments, and the arrangement of bodies beneath floors. Meaning has to be approached carefully. A vulture carved into a pillar may be a symbol of death, sky, transformation, clan identity, myth, or something else entirely. A T-shaped stone may represent a human body, an ancestor, a spirit, or a social idea no modern category quite captures. No single explanation fully accounts for it. Still, the scale is undeniable. At Göbekli Tepe, circular and oval enclosures contain massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing many tons. Their surfaces are not crude, they are carefully worked, sometimes with relief carvings that show confidence and style. The people who made them were not merely surviving from day to day. They were investing labour into places that mattered beyond immediate hunger. That alone changes the emotional landscape of prehistory. It suggests that long before the first crown was worn in Egypt, human communities were already building worlds out of shared imagination. The hill itself seems almost designed for a revelation, though that is only hindsight. Göbekli Tepe sits on a high limestone ridge, with wide views across the surrounding plains. From there, the land opens in all directions, and in the deep past it would have looked different from the dry fields and modern villages nearby. Herds moved across the region, wild cereals grew in patches, pistachio and almond trees, steppe grasses, springs, seasonal streams, and limestone outcrops formed a patchwork of resources. For mobile groups, such a place could become more than a stop. It could become a meeting ground, a landmark, a stage where scattered communities gathered and became, for a time, something larger than themselves. That is one of the most important clues. Monumental architecture does not require a city in the later sense, but it does require coordination. Someone has to decide where the pillars go. Someone has to know how to cut them from bedrock. Someone has to feed the workers or organize feasts around the work. Someone has to remember the forms and repeat them across generations. Authority may not yet be royal, but influence exists. Leadership may be temporary, ritual, earned, or distributed among groups. The evidence does not allow certainty, but it does not show chaos. It shows structure without the familiar machinery of the state. This older world also arrives at a turning point in climate. The last ice age is ending. Temperatures rise, landscapes change, and then, suddenly, the younger Dryas interrupts the warming with a harsh return to colder and drier conditions in many regions. Plants retreat or shift. Animals move. Human groups adapt. In the Fertile Crescent, these pressures may have intensified the relationship between people and certain wild grains. What begins as gathering can become tending. What begins as repeated return can become settlement. What begins as ritual congregation can become the need for more predictable food. Scholars still debate the exact sequence, but the old divide between practical survival and symbolic life no longer holds. The sacred and the economic may have grown together. This is where the phrase before Egypt becomes more than a title. Egypt did not emerge from nowhere, neither did Sumer. The ancient world was built on thousands of years of experimentation with plants, animals, houses, storage, kinship, ritual, trade, memory, and landscape. The communities of prehistoric Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia were part of that long preparation. They were not Egyptians before Egypt, and they were not Sumerians before Sumer. They were themselves, living in a world with its own logic, one that later civilizations would partly inherit and partly erase. The surprise is that this world was hidden for so long in plain earth, for generations. The oldest monumental past seemed to belong to the first cities. Then the ground gave up older monuments, and the timeline stretched. Suddenly, the dawn of civilization looked less like a sunrise over a palace and more like firelight on a hilltop, with people gathering beneath carved animals, carrying food, stories, fears, and obligations from many valleys. It looked less like the invention of government and more like the slow thickening of human connection. There is a quiet irony here. The people who built these places may never have imagined permanence in the way later kings did. Some of their structures were deliberately buried. Their great enclosures were filled in, covered, and sealed. Instead of being abandoned to ruin, they were entombed. That act is still difficult to explain. It may have marked closure, renewal, protection, transformation, or changing beliefs. But it means that part of their world survived because they chose to hide it. The hill became a time capsule, not through accident alone, but through human intention. And so the story of this forgotten super-civilization must begin carefully, with both wonder and restraint. It is not the story of a vanished Atlantis commanding the globe. It is the story of something real, stranger, and in some ways more profound, a prehistoric cultural world that gathered before cities, built before kings, imagined before writing, and helped prepare the ground on which later civilizations would stand. Egypt's pyramids may dominate the horizon of ancient memory, but beneath them, far back in time, are older shadows, circles of stone, buried houses, painted walls, skulls beneath floors, obsidian moving across mountains, and communities learning how to turn shared meaning into enduring form. From the hilltop world of carved stone, the story widens into the land itself, because no civilization, no matter how strange or early, rises out of empty space. It rises from weather, water, animals, plants, memory, and the repeated choices of people who learn where life can be trusted. In the centuries before Egypt becomes Egypt, the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent is not a single kingdom or a single people, but a great living corridor. It bends from the Levant through southeastern Anatolia and into northern Mesopotamia, touching mountains, plains, river valleys, steppe, woodland, and volcanic country. It is a place of movement, but also of return. Groups travel, hunt, gather, meet, separate, and come back again, carrying with them not only tools and food, but stories about certain springs, certain ridges, certain animals, and certain dead. The rivers are crucial, but they are not yet the canalized rivers of later states. The upper Euphrates and Tigris are wilder, narrower, and more seasonal than the grand agricultural machines they later become downstream. Their tributaries cut through limestone and basalt landscapes, creating pockets of fertility where people can find fish, reeds, birds, fresh water, and animals drawn to the banks. Beyond the rivers, stands of wild wheat, barley, rye, lentils, peas, pistachios, almonds, and other useful plants grow in natural zones. This is one of the lesser-known keys to the entire story. Farming does not begin with people inventing food from nothing. It begins where nature has already gathered the ancestors of future crops into dense enough patches that human attention can slowly change them. For hunter-gatherers living here at the end of the Ice Age, the world is not random wilderness, it is mapped through experience. A hillside may be known for good flint, a valley may be known for gazelle at a certain season, a grove may be known for nuts. A spring may become a meeting place because it can support many bodies at once. Over generations, these practical memories become social memories. Places gain meaning because grandparents went there, because ancestors were buried nearby, because certain animals appeared there, because ceremonies were held there, or because groups made agreements under the same sky. What survives in the record suggests that early communities were already binding landscape to identity long before they built anything that looked like a city. The climate, however, does not hold still. As the last ice age loosens its grip, warming reshapes the region. Grasslands spread and contract, trees advance into some areas, herd animals alter their routes, sea levels rise far away, slowly drowning old coastlines that once held human camps now lost beneath water. Then climate swings interrupt the warming, reminding people that abundance can be temporary. The evidence remains incomplete, especially when trying to connect one local site to one regional climate event. But the broad picture is clear enough: these communities live through a time of environmental instability, and instability rewards flexibility. Some groups remain mobile, some return more often to favoured places, some begin to manage plants, some may protect patches of wild grain or clear competing vegetation. Small acts, repeated long enough, become a revolution. This is why the old image of civilization beginning suddenly with a farmer planting a field is too simple. The shift is gradual and uneven. People continue hunting while gathering more intensively. They gather while experimenting with cultivation. They cultivate while still relying on wild resources. Dogs may already accompany some communities. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs are not yet fully domesticated everywhere, but humans are watching them closely, learning their habits, hunting them selectively, perhaps shaping their future without fully intending to. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition, because there is no single transition. There are many local experiments, some abandoned, some repeated, some transformed into permanent ways of life. The land encourages connection. Obsidian from volcanic sources in Anatolia travels far from its origin, prized for its sharpness and dark glassy beauty. Marine shells move inland from distant coasts. Stone tools show shared techniques across wide areas. Similar building forms appear in different settlements. These are not proofs of an empire, but they are proofs of contact. People know more than their immediate valley. They exchange objects, spouses, stories, ritual knowledge, and perhaps obligations. A person holding a piece of volcanic glass hundreds of miles from its source is holding evidence of a social world larger than the horizon. In this world, rivers do more than provide water. They guide movement. They create routes along which people, animals, and ideas travel. A group following game or visiting kin can move from uplands to plains and back again, learning the rhythms of different zones. Seasonal gathering may bring scattered bands together in numbers large enough to require rules, hospitality, performance, and shared symbols. The seeds of later complexity are not only in storage pits and grain baskets. They are in the problem of how to live with many people at once without tearing the group apart. Feasting may become one answer, ritual may become another, monument building may become a third. There is a surprising detail in the way early communities treat their surroundings. They often seem less interested in separating nature from culture than later civilizations do. Animals appear everywhere in the symbolic record: bulls, foxes, snakes, vultures, wild boar, cranes, scorpions, and other creatures are not background decoration. They are charged with meaning. Some may represent danger, some may represent power, death, transformation, clan identity, or mythic beings. Scholars still debate the details, and modern categories may distort what these images meant. But the intensity of animal imagery suggests a world in which humans do not yet imagine themselves as masters standing apart from nature. They are negotiating with it, fearing it, depending on it, and turning it into memory. The rivers and grasslands also create a tension that will shape everything to come. Abundance attracts people, but people can exhaust abundance. A valley that supports small groups comfortably may strain under repeated gatherings. More mouths require more predictable supplies. Feasts require stored food or coordinated hunting. Construction projects require labor that cannot hunt or gather while working. If people are gathering at ceremonial centers, someone must feed them. This does not prove that temples created farming, but it makes the possibility compelling. Ritual demand may have increased pressure for reliable grain, and reliable grain may have allowed ritual gatherings to grow larger. Each pushes the other. Long before written law, memory holds society together. People remember who owes whom, who married into which group, who has rights to a spring, who may harvest a stand of grain, who is buried beneath a house, who carved a symbol, who hosted a feast, who failed to give properly. In a mobile world, memory is portable. In a settling world, memory becomes anchored. A house can hold ancestors. A pillar can hold images. A buried skull can hold lineage. A plastered floor can become a surface walked by children above the dead. These practices are difficult to interpret, but they show that place is becoming heavier. The land is no longer only where life happens, it is where the past accumulates. And this accumulation changes the human imagination. A temporary camp leaves little behind, a return to place leaves more, a settlement leaves walls, repairs, burials, refuse, hearths, and the layered debris of ordinary life. Archaeologists read these layers like compressed time, ash from fires, bones from meals, seeds from storage or waste, worn stone floors, collapsed roofs, and rebuilding episodes reveal people coming back again and again, sometimes for centuries. The great surprise is that such continuity appears before the full package of later civilization. The roots are older, messier, and more experimental. The forgotten world before Egypt is therefore not a single capital waiting to be discovered. It is a network of landscapes slowly becoming social worlds. Its power lies in repeated gathering, shared symbols, ecological knowledge, and the ability to make certain places matter so much that people return even when survival would be easier elsewhere. Egypt's Nile will later offer a different kind of stability along river, predictable floods, rich silt, and a corridor that lends itself to unification. But in the older north, the pattern is more scattered. Complexity grows in pockets, across hills and valleys, through relationships rather than royal command. This is why the stones of Göbekli Tepe do not stand alone. They are the visible crest of a much wider wave. Beneath them are rivers and grasslands, wild grains and hunted animals, seasonal paths and remembered springs, climate shocks and human patience. The builders inherit a landscape already filled with meaning. When they raise pillars on a limestone ridge, they are not beginning from emptiness. They're giving form to a world that has been gathering in memory for thousands of years. On the limestone ridge of Göbekli Tepe, The stones do not merely stand, they seem to wait. They rise from circular enclosures cut into the hill, broad-shouldered and silent, their T-shaped forms suggesting bodies reduced to their most essential outline. Some carry carved belts and hands, as if the pillars themselves are beings, not supports. Around them, animals glide and coil in relief foxes with narrow bodies, snakes moving like lines of thought, boars with bristling menace, birds with long legs, scorpions, wild cattle, and creatures whose meaning has slipped beyond reach. The place feels less like an early village than a gathering of presences, and that is precisely what makes it so difficult to fit into the older story of civilization. When excavations reveal the depth and age of the site, Göbekli Tepe unsettled a comfortable sequence. It belonged to the pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly the 10th and 9th millennia BCE, before pottery, before metallurgy, before cities, and before the first Egyptian dynasty by many thousands of years. The builders were living at the edge of the great transformation from hunting and gathering toward farming. Yet the monuments seemed to appear before all the expected foundations were fully in place. Here was planned architecture, heavy stone transport, relief carving, repeated symbolic forms, and evidence of large communal effort. What survives in the records suggests not a fully urban civilization, but a society already capable of organizing people around shared belief with extraordinary force. The hill itself may have been chosen because it could be seen and remembered. It commands the surrounding landscape, and in deep prehistory that mattered. People moving across the plains and uplands would have recognized such ridges as landmarks. To climb to the summit was to leave the ordinary scale of daily life and enter a place where the horizon opened. The view may have included hunting territories, plant-gathering zones, routes of seasonal movement, and distant places connected by kinship and exchange. The monuments did not need city walls around them to become central. A place can be central because people return to it, because stories gather there, because work is invested there, and because the dead or the unseen are believed to be near. The enclosures were built with limestone taken from nearby bedrock. This detail matters because it makes the achievement more concrete. The builders did not have to move stone from impossibly far away, but they still had to quarry pillars weighing several tons, shape them, transport them, set them upright, and arrange them carefully. Their tools were stone. Their labor was human. The work required planning, skill, timing, and likely food on a scale beyond a single household. There are no royal inscriptions explaining who commanded it. There is no evidence of a pharaoh-like figure ordering the hill into shape, yet the result is coordinated. The absence of kings does not mean the absence of authority. It means authority may have taken forms that later civilizations make harder for us to recognize. At the center of some enclosures stand two larger pillars facing each other, while smaller pillars form a ring around them. This arrangement has inspired many interpretations. Some scholars see stylized human figures, perhaps ancestors or supernatural beings. Others emphasize animal symbolism, ritual performance, death practices, feasting, or social integration among dispersed groups. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the site. But one thing is difficult to deny: the builders created spaces meant to be experienced. These were not random piles of stone. They were organized environments where movement, sight, and memory were guided. A person entering one of these enclosures would have been surrounded by carved forms, enclosed by stone bodies, and drawn toward the central pair. One lesser-known aspect of Göbekli Tepe is that its power is not limited to the famous large circles. This site includes multiple building phases, smaller rectangular structures, earlier monumental spaces, later modifications, and layers of intentional filling. It was not a single project completed all at once. It was a place revisited, rebuilt, reworked, and eventually buried. This long use suggests continuity, but also change. Beliefs may have shifted. Social needs may have altered. The same hill could mean different things across generations. The stone enclosures are not frozen moments. They are the surviving bones of a living tradition. The carvings add another layer of mystery because they are both precise and elusive. The animals are not arranged like a modern picture book of wildlife. They appear in charged combinations, sometimes isolated, sometimes crowded, sometimes positioned in ways that seem deliberate but resist translation. Vultures are especially intriguing because in later and nearby Neolithic contexts, birds and skulls may connect to death and the treatment of bodies, but caution is necessary. A vulture at Göbekli Tepe does not automatically mean the same thing everywhere. A snake may represent danger, water, rebirth, underworld forces, or something entirely different. Scholars still debate whether these images encode myths, social identities, rituals, seasonal signs, or cosmological ideas. Without writing, meaning must be inferred from context, and context often speaks in fragments. Food remains help bring the site down from pure mystery into human life. Archaeologists have found evidence connected with large-scale consumption, including animal bones and plant remains. Gazelle and other wild animals appear prominently. This suggests that gatherings at Göbekli Tepe may have involved feasting, perhaps after hunts or during seasonal meetings. Feasting is not a trivial detail. In small-scale societies, feasts can create alliances, repay obligations, display generosity, recruit labor, and transform strangers into temporary communities. A monument may begin with belief, but belief needs bodies, and bodies need food. The smell of roasted meat, crushed grain, sweat, smoke, dust, and limestone would have been part of the sacred atmosphere as much as the carvings themselves. This makes Göbekli Tepe less alien, not less impressive. It was not built by beings outside history, and it does not require lost technology. It was built by humans with deep knowledge of their landscape and strong reasons to come together. The achievement lies precisely there. People without writing or metal could still imagine forms that outlived them. They could still coordinate labor. They could still create ritual landscapes. They could still shape stone into symbols large enough to reorganize how later ages understand them. The deliberate burial of the enclosures remains one of the strangest parts of the site. At some point, monumental spaces were filled with stone rubble, debris, bones, and sediment. This was not simple abandonment. The act required effort. It may have been a closing ritual, a way of preserving power, a response to changing beliefs, or part of a cycle in which sacred spaces were retired and replaced. The evidence does not allow a final answer, but the burial gave the monuments their afterlife. Hidden beneath the hill, protected from erosion and later disturbance, they survived while countless open-air structures elsewhere vanished. Göbekli Tepe also belongs to a broader constellation, nearby and related sites, including Karahan Tepe and others in the Taştepeler region, show that this was not a single isolated miracle. Similar T-shaped pillars, special buildings, carved imagery, and communal architecture appear across a wider landscape. This does not prove a unified state, but it does reveal a shared symbolic world. Ideas moved. Builders learned from other builders. Communities recognized forms that meant something across distance. The forgotten super-civilization. if that phrase is used carefully, is not a hidden empire. It is a deep cultural network, powerful enough to shape stone and memory before the classic machinery of civilization exists. And here the old sequence bends. For a long time, monumental sacred architecture was expected to come after settled farming communities had become prosperous enough to support it. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the desire to gather, honor, fear, remember, and perform may have helped drive people toward new forms of life. Ritual did not wait at the end of the civilizing process like decoration on a palace wall. It may have stood near the beginning, pulling people together, demanding food, creating obligations and making settlement more attractive or necessary. This is still debated, and the relationship between ritual and agriculture was probably different from place to place, but the possibility changes everything. The stones on the ridge therefore mark more than an archaeological site. They mark a reversal in imagination. Civilization is not only irrigation channels, written accounts, and royal tombs. It is also the capacity to make shared meaning durable. It is the ability to gather beyond the household, to build for the unseen, to remember through form, and to bind people into a story larger than survival. Göbekli Tepe stands before Egypt not as Egypt's secret parent, but as evidence that the human road to civilization began earlier, in stranger terrain, with people who had no need to call themselves civilized in order to change history. The people who raised the pillars did not live in the kind of world that later historians instinctively understand. There is no capital city to name, no royal line to follow, no empire spreading across a map in clean colours, no archive where officials record grain and labour. Their society has to be approached from the side, through the marks left by hands on stone, the bones of animals eaten in groups, the worn edges of tools, and the quiet logic of repeated construction. They are often described as hunter-gatherers, and that is true in the broad sense, but the phrase can mislead if it makes them sound scattered, simple, or incapable of sustained organization. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe and related sites suggests something much more complicated: builders without cities, planners without writing, communities without kings who still knew how to create places that commanded loyalty. To understand this, it helps to set aside the later image of civilization as a pyramid, with a ruler at the top and laborers below. Early monumental work may not have required permanent hierarchy. It may have grown from seasonal gatherings, ritual obligations, skilled leadership, competition between groups, or ceremonies in which cooperation itself became sacred. A person did not need to be a king to persuade others to work. Influence could belong to elders, ritual specialists, successful hunters, respected lineages, or hosts capable of feeding many people. Authority may have been temporary, negotiated, and tied to particular events. Scholars still debate how much social inequality existed in these communities because the evidence remains incomplete, but the monuments show that some form of coordination was real. The labour itself is worth imagining slowly. A limestone pillar begins as bedrock. Someone selects the place to cut. Others use flint tools and stone hammers to carve channels around the intended shape. The work is repetitive, loud, dusty, and dangerous. The pillar must be freed without breaking, then moved over uneven ground. Ropes made from plant fibre or hide may have been used, though the exact methods are uncertain. Wooden rollers are often imagined, but suitable timber, terrain, and practical evidence complicate simple reconstructions. What matters is not one clever trick, but the collective knowledge required. People had to understand stone, leverage, timing, slope, and human strength. They had to work together in rhythm. That rhythm, repeated over days or weeks, is itself a kind of social technology. Food would have been central to that technology. Workers cannot carve on symbolism alone. Large gatherings require meat, seeds, nuts, water, and planning. The animal bones at these sites suggest hunting on a considerable scale, especially of wild species such as gazelle, aurochs, boar, and other animals depending on location and period. Grain may have been gathered wild, processed, perhaps brewed or cooked in communal settings. One surprising detail often discussed is the possibility that large stone vessels and plant processing might point to early forms of cereal-based feasting, perhaps even fermented drink, though this remains debated and should not be overstated. Still, the broader point holds communal eating likely helped bind people to the work. A feast can reward labour, create obligation, display generosity, and turn construction into celebration. In societies without written contracts, such obligations matter deeply. If one group helps another raise a pillar, the debt may not be recorded in numbers, but it is remembered. If a lineage hosts a gathering, its prestige grows. If hunters provide meat for a ceremony, their skill becomes part of the sacred event. Cooperation does not erase competition. In fact, monument building may have been one way communities competed without open violence, each group demonstrating its connection to powerful places, ancestors, animals, or spirits. No single explanation fully accounts for the social life behind the stones, but it is likely that belief, politics, kinship, and food were tangled together from the beginning. This is one reason the phrase temple can be useful and dangerous at the same time. It gives a modern listener a sense that these buildings were special, not ordinary houses, but it also smuggles in later ideas of priests, congregations, gods, and formal worship that may not fit. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were probably not temples in the Egyptian sense, and not churches in any modern sense. They were special-purpose buildings, charged spaces, perhaps places of ritual performance, memory, initiation, death, or alliance. Their meaning may have shifted by season and generation. What survives in the record suggests sacred architecture, but the exact sacred story is lost. The same caution applies to the people themselves. They were not simply nomads drifting randomly across the landscape. Many hunter-gatherer societies are highly territorial, knowledgeable, and structured. They may return to the same places every year, manage resources, maintain exchange partners, arrange marriages across distance, and hold elaborate ceremonies. Mobility does not mean rootlessness. A group can move through a landscape and still belong to it intensely. In the world before full farming, belonging may have been spread across routes rather than fixed inside walls. A spring, a hunting ground, a burial place, a quarry, and a ritual hill could all form part of a community's home. This helps explain how a site like Göbekli Tepe could draw people without being a city. Its population may have swelled during gatherings and thinned at other times. People may have arrived from different valleys, bringing food, tools, ornaments, stories, and symbolic knowledge. Some may have stayed longer, tending the site, repairing structures, preparing ceremonies, or guarding memory. Others came and went. The place may have functioned less like a permanent town and more like a ceremonial centre, whose importance depended on repeated return. Later, civilizations often concentrate people in dense settlements. This earlier world may have concentrated attention instead. There is also skill specialization, though not necessarily full-time professions. The carvings on the pillars show practiced hands. Relief work requires planning and confidence. Toolmakers producing fine flint blades or projectile points also show expertise. People who knew how to plaster floors, arrange stone walls, shape beads, or prepare pigments may have held valued knowledge. Yet this does not mean there were formal artisan classes in the later urban sense. A person could be a hunter, builder, ritual participant, and craft specialist at different moments. Roles may have been flexible, seasonal, and embedded in kinship rather than separated into occupations. The absence of cities also changes how power leaves traces. Later rulers build palaces, tombs, fortifications, and inscriptions that shout their authority across time. These early communities leave subtler signals. There are monumental spaces but not obvious palaces. There are special objects but not royal treasure hoards. There are differences in labour and symbolism, but not clear evidence of a ruling dynasty. This has led some scholars to see these societies as relatively communal, while others argue that emerging inequalities may be hidden in forms archaeology has not yet fully recognised. The debate remains open. Complexity does not always look like oppression, but neither should a lack of kings be romanticised as perfect equality. What is certain is that these builders possessed organisational intelligence. They solved problems that required more than individual brilliance. They knew how to gather people, transmit design traditions, repeat symbolic forms, and maintain special places across time. In a world without written plans, memory had to carry architecture. Instructions were spoken, demonstrated, embodied. A young person learned by watching older hands cut stone, mix plaster, butcher animals, arrange offerings, or prepare a surface for carving. Knowledge lived in practice. It moved from body to body. That may be the most human part of the mystery. The forgotten super-civilization before Egypt was not super because it had machines, lost science, or impossible powers. It was extraordinary because it reveals how much human beings could do with social imagination alone. They could turn a ridge into a gathering place, animals into symbols, labour into obligation, and stone into memory. They could build without cities because the city was not yet the only container for complexity. Their world was held together by roots, seasons, feasts, rituals, kinship, and stories strong enough to move tons of limestone. And as these gatherings repeated, something began to shift. A place that draws people again and again changes the demands of life around it. More predictable food becomes useful. More permanent shelters become attractive. More careful storage begins to matter. The boundary between seasonal camp and settlement starts to blur. The builders without cities are not standing outside the story of civilization. They are pressing against its threshold, not by inventing kingship, but by discovering that people could become larger together than they were apart. The world that gathers around these stones is not stable. It is living through one of the great climatic jolts in human history, a sharp interruption in the long thaw after the Ice Age. For thousands of years, glaciers have been retreating, temperatures have been rising, forests and grasslands have been rearranging themselves across continents, and human groups have been learning the new geography of survival. Then the climate turns. The younger Dryas arrives like a hand closing over the warming world, bringing colder and often drier conditions across many regions, and in the Fertile Crescent its effects ripple through plants, animals, water, and human choice. It is not a single disaster in the cinematic sense. Not one storm or one flood that destroys everything overnight. It is slower, wider, and in some ways more dangerous a change in the rules by which landscapes feed people. For communities living by hunting, gathering, and seasonal return, Climate is not an abstract background. It is the difference between a hillside thick with grain and one that ripens poorly, between gazelle herds moving predictably and herds shifting away, between a spring lasting through the dry season and failing early. The people of southeastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia do not know the term Younger Dryas. Of course, they experience it as hunger in familiar places, altered animal paths, colder winds, thinner harvests of wild seeds, and the need to look again at landscapes their ancestors thought they understood. What survives in the records suggests pressure, adaptation, and local variation rather than a single uniform collapse. The Younger Dryas begins around 12,900 years ago and lasts for more than a millennium, ending around 11,700 years ago, close to the beginning of the Holocene, the warmer epoch in which all later recorded civilizations arise. Its causes are still studied, but mainstream explanations focus on disruptions to ocean circulation and meltwater from retreating ice sheets, not on a proven civilization-ending impact or a lost technological catastrophe. Popular theories sometimes connect this period to comet strikes, instant global floods, or the destruction of an advanced prehistoric empire, but these claims remain disputed and unsupported as explanations for the archaeological record as a whole. The real story is quieter and more powerful. Climate instability presses human communities into new relationships with food, place, and one another. In the Near East, this pressure may have mattered enormously. Wild cereals are rich resources, but they are also sensitive to climate and season. If people return to the same stands of grain and find them less reliable, they face a choice. They can move more widely, compete more intensely, reduce group size, or begin to intervene. Intervention does not have to begin as farming. It may begin as protecting certain patches, scattering seeds near camp, choosing larger grains, harvesting at particular times, clearing unwanted plants, or returning more carefully to places where useful species grow. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly how climate stress interacted with human behavior. But the larger pattern is hard to ignore. Under pressure, people experiment. The strange thing is that this stress does not simply scatter people. In some places, it may help gather them. When resources become unpredictable, alliances matter, information matters, shared ritual matters, a group that knows where another group has found food, water, flint, or safety has an advantage. A gathering place can become a survival technology, not only a sacred one. Ceremonies may renew social bonds that later become essential during difficult seasons. Feasting, even when costly, can advertise reliability. The ability to host others signals that a community has access to resources, skill, and social strength. In harsh times, generosity is never only generosity. It is a form of power. Göbekli Tepe and the wider ritual landscape appear in this context of transition. They are not simply monuments floating above the weather. Their builders live through climatic uncertainty, and their gatherings likely respond to more than one need at once. A carved pillar may belong to belief, but the people around it still need meat, water, grain, and trust. If ritual gatherings encourage repeated congregation, they also increase demand for predictable food. That demand may have helped pull some communities toward cultivation. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of farming, but the old picture of passive humans waiting for agriculture to happen is no longer convincing. People were making choices inside unstable environments. The animals also tell part of the story. In earlier periods, Wild herds offer abundance where conditions are right. Gazelle, wild cattle, wild sheep, wild goats, boar, deer, and other animals are hunted across different zones. But changing climate can alter vegetation, and vegetation alters animal movement. Human hunters must follow, adapt, or intensify. Selective hunting may slowly change relationships with certain species. In some regions, people begin moving from hunting wild animals to managing and eventually domesticating them. Though the timing varies, sheep and goats become especially important in the broader Neolithic transformation. The road from hunter to herder is not a straight line. It is a long negotiation between human desire and animal behavior. One lesser-known but important detail is that domestication is visible not simply when humans decide to keep animals, but when animal bodies begin to change over generations. Archaeologists look for shifts in age and sex profiles, horn shapes, body size, and kill patterns. These signs appear unevenly, showing that early management was experimental. Some communities may have controlled herds more directly, others continued to hunt. Some practices succeeded, others vanished. This messy evidence is exactly what one would expect if civilization did not begin as a plan, but as a series of local adjustments to a changing world. The younger Dryas also deepens the emotional force of ritual. In uncertain conditions, people often intensify symbolic life. This does not mean ritual is a crude response to fear, but it does suggest that belief helps organize action when practical knowledge alone cannot guarantee survival. If rain fails, if herds move, if cold returns, if familiar plants no longer behave as expected, communities may turn more strongly towards ceremonies that bind them to ancestors, animals, land, and one another. The carved creatures of Göbekli Tepe may belong partly to this world of negotiation. They are not decorations on a settled civilization. They are images made at a time when humans are still deeply entangled with wild powers. And then, after more than 1,000 years, the climate shifts again. The Younger Dryas ends abruptly in geological terms, and the Holocene warming opens new possibilities. Warmer and more stable conditions in many regions favour the spread of farming and settled life. But by then, human communities have changed too. They have already learned to gather in larger numbers, build special places, process wild grains intensively, remember territories, exchange materials across distance, and perhaps cultivate in small ways. When the climate becomes more favourable, those experiments do not disappear, they expand. This is one of the most important turning points in the deep history before Egypt. Climate stress does not simply create civilization, as though drought automatically builds temples. Many societies face hardship without becoming farmers or monument builders. But in this particular region, at this particular time, environmental pressure meets unusual biological richness and human social creativity. Wild ancestors of major crops are present. Huntable animals are present. Routes of exchange are present. Ritual centers are present. Memory is already anchored to place. The ingredients are not enough by themselves, but together they create a field of possibility. The people living through this transition cannot know they are approaching the threshold of the Neolithic world. They are not trying to invent civilization. They are trying to keep life going, to honor what matters, to feed gatherings, to survive difficult seasons, to remain connected to places and people. Yet the consequences of their adjustments are enormous. A harvested stand becomes a tended patch. A tended patch becomes a cultivated field. A seasonal shelter becomes a house. A house becomes an inherited place. A gathering becomes a settlement. A ritual obligation becomes organized labor. Slowly, unevenly, the human relationship with the earth changes. The shock of the Younger Dryas, therefore, stands in the story not as a single apocalypse, but as a deep pressure that exposes the flexibility of human societies. It tests old ways of moving through the land and encourages new ones. It turns memory into strategy. It makes cooperation more valuable. It sharpens the importance of food, gathering, and place. And when the world warms again, the communities that have endured are no longer exactly what they were. The stones on the ridge remain, but around them the human world is beginning to root itself more deeply into the soil. As the cold grip of the Younger Dryas loosens and the warmer Holocene world begins to settle into place, the old rhythms do not vanish all at once. People still hunt, they still gather wild plants, they still move through landscapes that their ancestors have known for generations. But something has changed in the relationship between humans and place. Certain camps are no longer simply visited and left behind. Certain food sources are no longer merely found. Certain buildings are no longer temporary shelters against wind and weather. A new kind of gravity begins to form around the places where people return, rebuild, bury their dead, store their food, and remember who they are. This is the slow passage from ritual to settlement, and it is one of the most important transformations in the human story. It does not happen in a single village, in a single generation, or because one brilliant person invents farming one morning and history obediently changes direction. It unfolds unevenly across the northern Fertile Crescent, shaped by local climates, wild species, traditions, and choices. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much ritual gathering encouraged settlement, and how much settlement made ritual architecture possible. But what survives in the record suggests that these two forces were not separate. People came together for meaning, and coming together created new demands. Those demands made food, shelter, storage, and social order more urgent. In the older world of seasonal gathering, a sacred hill or special building could draw people for ceremonies, feasts, exchanges, and alliances. But repeated gathering has consequences. Large groups need more than inspiration. They need predictable supplies. They need places to prepare food, dispose of waste, repair tools, treat injuries, and sleep. They need arrangements for conflict, kinship, marriage, and obligation. They need ways to decide who contributes and who receives. The more often people return, the more the ground becomes marked by human repetition. Hearths are remade, pits are dug again, walls are repaired, floors are resurfaced. Children grow up knowing a place not as a stop along a route, but as a centre. Early villages such as Jerf El Ahmar, Abu Huraira, Muraybet, Chayonu, Nevali Chori, and others show pieces of this transformation. Each site is different, and none should be treated as a simple stepping stone toward Egypt or Sumer, yet together they reveal a world becoming more settled, more architecturally ambitious, and more bound to cultivated life. Houses appear in changing forms, from round or oval structures to more rectilinear buildings. Communal buildings stand apart from ordinary domestic spaces. Storage becomes increasingly important. Groundstone tools for processing plants become common. Burials under floors link the living to the dead in intimate ways. A house is no longer only a shelter. It is a container of ancestry. The domestication of plants is especially subtle because it begins before it is fully visible. Archaeologists can identify domesticated cereals by changes such as tougher rachises, the part of the plant that holds seeds to the stalk, which makes grain less likely to shatter naturally and more dependent on human harvesting. But these biological changes take time. Before the plant body changes clearly, human behavior may already be changing. People harvest wild stands with greater intensity. They carry seeds. They plant or encourage growth near settlements. They weed, water, protect, or return at chosen moments. In this long grey zone, the boundary between gathering and farming blurs. No single explanation fully accounts for it, because there was no sharp boundary for the people living through it. This ambiguity matters because it makes the rise of settlement feel less like a revolution imposed from above and more like a habit becoming destiny. A community that stores grain must protect it. A community that protects grain may stay longer. A community that stays longer builds stronger houses. Stronger houses make leaving harder. Buried ancestors make leaving harder still. The dead become anchors, beneath plastered floors, under benches, near walls. Human remains sometimes rest inside the spaces of everyday life. This can seem strange to modern eyes, but in many early Neolithic communities the dead are not fully removed from the household. They remain part of it, literally beneath the feet of the living. At some sites, skulls are removed, kept, plastered, painted, or treated separately, suggesting a complex relationship with ancestry and identity. These practices are not uniform, and scholars still debate whether they represent ancestor veneration, claims to houses, rituals of memory, social ranking, or beliefs about the soul and body that cannot be reconstructed with confidence. But they show that settlement is not only practical, it is emotional and symbolic. People stay because food is there, but also because the past is there. The house becomes a memory device. The village becomes a layered archive without writing. This is one of the great surprises of the pre-Egyptian world. Some of the earliest experiments in settled life are not dominated by grand public monuments alone, but by the intimate power of domestic space. At Sayonu, for example, changing building types and special structures suggest that community organization was evolving over time. At Nivali Chori, T-shaped pillars appear in a special building, linking the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe with more settled contexts. This connection is important. It suggests that the ritual language of the great hilltop enclosures did not simply disappear. It entered villages, changed scale, and became part of new ways of living. Food production intensified alongside these changes. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and other plants became more central. Sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle moved along different paths toward domestication. The process was regional and uneven. Some communities relied more on plants, others on animals, others on mixed strategies. Farming did not instantly make life easier. In fact, early farmers often worked harder, ate less varied diets, and lived closer to disease and crowding than many foragers. This is a lesser-known detail that complicates the triumphant story of agriculture. The move into settled farming was not simply progress. It brought new burdens, labour, storage risk, crop failure, social tension, and dependence on fewer foods. Yet it also created new possibilities. Surplus, even modest surplus, allows some people to do things other than find food every day. It supports larger gatherings, craft work, construction, and exchange. It allows communities to remain in one place long enough to accumulate possessions, repair buildings, and create deeper local histories. It turns land into inheritance. Once fields matter, access to them matters. Once herds matter, ownership or control begins to matter. The roots of inequality may lie here, not as a sudden fall from innocence, but as a gradual consequence of stored value. Still, early settlement is not the same as the state. These villages are not yet cities. They do not show the full machinery of taxation, bureaucracy, armies, or royal rule. Their complexity is more diffuse. Communal buildings may express shared identity rather than centralized command. Houses may be broadly similar in size, though differences appear. Ritual may belong to households, lineages, or community groups rather than formal priesthoods. The evidence remains incomplete, and every site has its own pattern, but this uncertainty is itself revealing. Civilization did not have one inevitable shape. Before palaces, there were many experiments in how humans could live together. As people settle, their relationship with animals changes too. Wild creatures continue to haunt their imagination, but domestic animals slowly enter daily life in new ways. Goats and sheep become living stores of meat, milk, hides, and social wealth. Cattle remain powerful, sometimes practical, sometimes symbolic. Their wild ancestors still remembered in the massive presence of bulls and aurochs imagery. The boundary between the wild and the managed becomes one of the central tensions of Neolithic life. People are not leaving nature behind. They are drawing certain parts of it closer, reshaping them, and being reshaped in return. The settlement also transforms time. Mobile life often follows seasonal cycles across space. Village life stacks time vertically. One generation builds over another. Floors are renewed. Walls collapse and are rebuilt. Burials accumulate. Trash heaps grow. Paths become habitual. The village becomes a physical memory of repeated decisions. A child born there inherits not only a family but a built environment full of traces. The past becomes harder to escape, and the future becomes more tied to particular ground. This is the quiet turning point behind the more dramatic monuments. The forgotten world before Egypt is beginning to root itself. The ceremonial energy that once gathered people at special places now mingles with the practical needs of staying alive in dense communities. The sacred does not disappear into the domestic. It seeps into walls, floors, hearths, storage rooms, and burials. People are learning to live inside their own accumulated history. By the time larger settlements emerge, the old world of purely seasonal return has already been transformed. The stones still remember gatherings on ridges, but below them, in valleys and plains, people are building houses that hold the dead, tending plants that hold them in place, and creating communities that will eventually make cities imaginable. Egypt is still far in the future. Sumer is still far in the future. But the essential human experiment has begun: how to stay, how to share, how to remember, and how to survive the consequences of becoming permanent. Farther west from the old ritual hills and northern Mesopotamian villages, another settlement rises into the story like a different answer to the same ancient problem. Çatalhöyük does not look like Göbekli Tepe. It has no great circular enclosures on a lonely ridge, no towering T-shaped pillars staring across the plains. Instead, it spreads low and dense across the Konya plain of central Anatolia, a mound made from thousands of years of living, rebuilding, burying, plastering, painting, cooking, sleeping, and beginning again. From a distance, it is not a city of monuments, but a city of houses, if city is even the right word. It belongs to a later stage of the Neolithic world, flourishing mainly in the 7th millennium BCE, long after the first great ritual centers but still thousands of years before Egypt's pyramids. It is younger than Göbekli Tepe, yet it preserves something equally strange: a large, complex community with no obvious palace. no streets in the familiar sense, no royal tombs and no written names. The first surprise is its density. Çatalhöyük is built as a packed mass of mud brick houses, pressed against one another so tightly that movement often happens across rooftops rather than along open streets. People enter homes through roof openings, descending by ladders into rooms where hearths, platforms, storage spaces, and burial places occupy carefully maintained interiors. The settlement is not arranged around broad avenues or public squares in the later urban style. It is more like a living honeycomb, a human-made mound where roofs become pathways and houses become the primary units of social life. The effect must have been intimate, crowded, smoky, and deeply familiar. Neighbours crossed over roofs, children played above rooms where ancestors lay beneath platforms. Cooking fires sent smoke through openings into the sky. The whole settlement breathed upward. Inside the houses, the domestic and the sacred blur almost completely. Walls are replastered again and again, sometimes many dozens of times, creating surfaces renewed through repeated care. Some walls carry paintings, geometric patterns, animals, human figures, hunting scenes, vultures, and perhaps one of the earliest known landscape-like images, often interpreted as a view of the settlement with a nearby erupting volcano, though that interpretation remains debated. Bullhorns and skulls are set into benches and walls. Burials are placed beneath floors and platforms, often under sleeping or working areas. The house is not merely where people live. It is where memory is stored, where identity is rebuilt, where the dead remain close, and where everyday labour touches ritual again and again. This is why Çatalhöyük feels like a house world. Later civilizations often separate temples, tombs, palaces, workshops, and homes into different zones. Here, those boundaries are less clear. A room can be a kitchen, a sleeping place, a burial chamber, a ritual space, and a memory archive at the same time. Scholars still debate how to interpret this arrangement. Some houses may have held special social or ritual importance, while others were more ordinary. Some buildings contain more elaborate installations, more paintings, or more burials, but the evidence does not point to a single central temple ruling the settlement. Power, meaning, and ancestry seem distributed through households. If Göbekli Tepe gathered people around special communal enclosures, Çatalhöyük gathers meaning inward, into the home. The people of Çatalhöyük farm and herd, but they are not detached from the wild. They cultivate cereals and pulses, they keep sheep and goats, they hunt wild cattle, deer, boar, and other animals. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, remains especially charged in their symbolic world. Its horns and skulls appear in houses, and wild bull imagery carries a force that seems greater than ordinary food value. This is one of the more striking continuities with earlier Neolithic worlds. Even as humans domesticate plants and animals, the wild remains powerful in imagination. Domestic life does not erase danger. It frames it, brings it into plastered rooms, and turns it into memory. Daily life would have been physically demanding. Grain had to be harvested, ground, cooked, and stored. Animals had to be managed. Houses required constant maintenance because mud brick and plaster wear down. Roofs had to be repaired. Floors had to be cleaned and resurfaced. Tools had to be made from obsidian, flint, bone, wood, and clay. Food preparation left traces in teeth and bones, including the wear caused by stone-ground flour containing tiny grit. Settlement brought crowding. Smoke inhalation, waste management problems, and disease risks. The rise of village life was not a simple improvement over foraging. It created new hardships even as it created new forms of belonging. Yet Çatalhöyük endured for centuries, and that endurance demands explanation. It was not held together by visible kingship. There are no monumental palaces, no administrative tablets, no fortification walls clearly announcing centralized fear. What survives in the record suggests a community held together by shared practices at the household level, rebuilding in place, burying the dead beneath floors, maintaining wall surfaces, exchanging materials, and participating in a symbolic world rich with animals, bodies, and ancestral presence. The settlement's cohesion may have come less from command than from repetition. People lived in patterns their neighbours recognised. One lesser-known detail is the importance of removal and circulation within burial practice. Not every body remained intact forever. In some cases, skulls or other bones were later removed, handled, or reburied, suggesting that the dead could continue to have social lives after burial. This is not unique to Çatalhöyük, but here it appears inside a dense domestic world. Ancestors may have helped define household continuity, membership, or rights, though scholars still debate the precise meaning. The body was not always a finished thing once buried. It could remain part of ongoing relationships between the living and the past. Obsidian adds another dimension. Çatalhöyük lies within reach of central Anatolian volcanic sources, and obsidian tools from the settlement show how valuable this material was. Sharp, dark, glass-like, and beautiful. Obsidian was used for cutting tools and also moved through exchange networks. Its presence links the settlement to a wider world beyond the mound. Even a community so inwardly focused was not isolated. Materials, techniques, ornaments, and perhaps marriage partners moved through broader networks. The house world had horizons. The art of Çatalhöyük has often attracted bold interpretations, especially around female figurines and ideas of a mother-goddess cult. Earlier excavators and popular accounts sometimes presented the settlement as evidence for a peaceful goddess-centered society. Modern scholarship is more cautious. Female figurines exist, but they are not as dominant or straightforward as once imagined, and many figurines are animals or ambiguous forms. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the imagery. It is safer to say that Çatalhöyük had a rich symbolic life in which bodies, animals, fertility, death, and household memory mattered deeply. Anything beyond that must be handled carefully. This caution does not make the site less fascinating. It makes it more human. Çatalhöyük is not a lost utopia, not a hidden empire, not a simple matriarchy waiting to be rediscovered. It is a dense experiment in settled life, one that shows how people could live in large numbers without the obvious political architecture of later states. Its mysteries are not solved by forcing modern fantasies onto it. They are found in the small repetitions, the replastered wall, the ladder through the roof, the child buried beneath a platform, the bullhorn set into a room, the obsidian blade carried across the plain, the smoke rising from hundreds of houses pressed together under the Anatolian sun. In the larger story before Egypt, Çatalhöyük matters because it shows another route toward complexity. Göbekli Tepe suggests that ritual gathering could create monumental centers before full urban life. Çatalhöyük suggests that dense settlement could grow around households rather than palaces. Together, they challenge the idea that civilization has only one beginning. The deep past is not a straight road from farming to kings. It is a landscape of experiments, some public and monumental, others domestic and inward, all testing how humans might live with memory, food, death, and one another. By the time Çatalhöyük flourishes, the world has moved far beyond the first shock of settlement. People are now deeply entangled with cultivated plants, managed animals, inherited houses, and social traditions that stretch across generations. But they still live close to uncertainty. Crop failures, disease, conflict, and environmental shifts remain constant threats. The community survives not because it escapes fragility, but because it builds systems of meaning strong enough to hold daily life together. In every replastered wall, there is maintenance. In every burial beneath a floor, there is continuity. In every roof path crossed by neighbours, there is a society making itself again. And so the forgotten pre-Egyptian world becomes richer and stranger. It is no longer only the world of carved pillars on a hill. It is also the world of crowded houses, hidden ancestors, painted walls, and domestic rooms dense with symbolism. It reminds us that before civilization becomes a matter of kings and inscriptions, it is already present in quieter forms in the organization of space, in the care of surfaces, in the power of households, and in the stubborn human decision to remain. The most difficult thing about this forgotten world is that it refuses to become the kind of civilization later history teaches us to recognize. It is large in imagination, skilled in construction, rich in symbolism, connected by exchange, and capable of sustaining dense communities, yet it does not present itself through the usual signs of ancient power. There are no royal names carved into stone. There are no armies marching in relief. There are no palaces rising above common houses. No tax records. No bureaucratic seals announcing who owns the grain. No dynastic tombs demanding that one person be remembered above all others. It is complex, but not in the familiar language of kings. That absence has often been mistaken for simplicity. For a long time, archaeology was shaped by the visible remains of states, because states are very good at leaving behind hard evidence. Palaces are large, fortifications are obvious, royal burials attract attention. Writing preserves authority in its own voice. A ruler who orders a monument often makes sure the monument explains who ordered it. But societies without writing and without palaces leave a different kind of record. Their power is distributed through houses, rituals, repeated practices, exchange routes, food systems, and shared symbols. It takes longer to see, and even when seen, it remains harder to name. This is why the phrase super-civilization must be handled carefully. If it means a lost empire with a single capital, advanced machines, and secret knowledge passed to Egypt, the evidence does not support it. But if it means a broad prehistoric world more socially sophisticated than older models allowed, then the phrase points towards something real. These communities were not states, yet they were not merely small, isolated bands. They built monumental ritual spaces, maintained large settlements, moved valuable materials across distance, developed farming and herding, created symbolic art, buried and sometimes curated their dead, and sustained traditions over centuries. What survives in the record suggests complexity without the usual state apparatus. A place like Çatalhöyük makes this especially clear. Thousands of people may have lived in close proximity at different moments in its history, yet the settlement lacks the central planning one expects from later cities. Houses are broadly similar, though not identical. Some contain more elaborate features, more burials, or richer symbolic installations, but there is no obvious palace. This does not mean everyone was equal in a modern sense. Inequality can exist without palaces. An influence can be hidden in kinship, ritual knowledge, control of exchange, or rights to particular houses. Scholars still debate the degree of hierarchy at such sites. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for how authority worked. But the pattern is not one of clear centralized kingship. This matters because it shows that human societies experimented with scale before they settled on monarchy and bureaucracy as dominant forms. Later states often solve the problem of large populations through administration, coercion, taxation, and law. Earlier communities had other tools. They used ancestry, household continuity, ritual obligation, seasonal gathering, feasting, shared symbols, and perhaps councils or informal leadership. These tools could hold people together, at least for a time. They could organize labor, settle disputes, and maintain identity. They were not necessarily gentle tools, but they were different from the machinery of the state. One surprising detail is how much early complexity may have depended on repetition rather than command. At Çatalhöyük, walls are replastered again and again. Houses are rebuilt on the same footprint. Bodies are buried under familiar platforms. At Göbekli Tepe, architectural forms and carved symbols are repeated across enclosures and generations. Such repetition creates order. It tells people what to do because it has been done before. Tradition becomes a kind of invisible architecture. In societies without written law, repeated practice can be as powerful as decree. It teaches belonging through action. Yet tradition can also create tension. Dense settlements produce friction. Neighbors live close enough to smell one another's smoke and hear one another's movements. Food must be shared, stored, protected, or negotiated. Burials beneath floors may strengthen household claims, but they may also intensify disputes over membership and inheritance. Ritual knowledge can unite a community, but it can also give power to those who control it. The absence of kings does not mean the absence of politics. It means politics is harder to excavate. This hidden politics may be one reason special buildings appear in some Neolithic settlements. Structures that differ from ordinary houses may have served communal purposes, ritual functions, or gatherings of particular groups. At some sites, special architecture seems to stand apart from domestic life. At others, the domestic and ritual are deeply intertwined. The variation is important. There was no single Neolithic constitution. Communities tried different arrangements, and those arrangements changed over time. Some leaned toward household-based identity. Others created more formal communal spaces. Some may have had ritual specialists. Others may have spread sacred authority more broadly. The record offers traces, not complete answers. The same uncertainty surrounds gender and social roles. Popular stories often swing between extremes, imagining either peaceful matriarchal goddess cultures or harsh male-dominated warrior societies. The evidence rarely supports such clean pictures. Female figurines, male imagery, animal symbolism, burial patterns, and house arrangements all require careful interpretation. At many sites, daily labor would have been divided by age, skill, kinship, and gender in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. What is clear is that women, men, children, elders, hunters, farmers, builders, and craft workers all participated in the making of these worlds. Civilization before palaces was not built by rulers alone because there were no rulers in the later sense to build it. It was made through households and communities. The lack of fortifications in some settlements has also tempted people to imagine peaceful societies. That may be partly true in some places and periods, but caution is needed. Violence can leave subtle traces. Conflict does not always require city walls. Skeletal injuries, burned buildings, abandoned settlements, and defensive locations sometimes reveal tension in the wider Neolithic world. Cooperation and conflict likely existed together, as they do in most human societies. The challenge is to avoid turning the past into either paradise or nightmare. The evidence suggests neither. It suggests people managing the difficult consequences of living more closely together than ever before. The economic base of these societies also complicates the picture. Farming and herding create food, but they also create dependence. Stored grain can feed a community through lean times, but it can be stolen, spoiled, monopolized, or used to create obligation. Herds can reproduce wealth, but they require pasture and protection. Land becomes more valuable when crops depend on it. Houses become more important when ancestors are buried beneath them. The roots of later inequality may grow in this soil, not all at once, not everywhere, and not in a form that looks like monarchy, but slowly, through differences in access, memory, labour, and prestige. This is where the forgotten world begins to cast a long shadow toward later civilizations. Sumer and Egypt will eventually develop institutions that make inequality visible: temples, estates, scribes, rulers, armies, and monumental tombs. But the problems those institutions manage are older. How should food be stored? Who controls land? Who organizes labor? Who speaks for the ancestors or the gods? Who settles disputes? Who receives surplus? Who belongs inside the community? These questions existed before writing. Early Neolithic societies answered them without tablets, and their answers may have varied widely. Calling them civilizations therefore depends on what one means by the word. If civilization requires cities, writing, state authority, and social classes, then these communities stand before civilization. If civilization means complex shared life, supported by architecture, memory, food production, symbolic systems, and wide networks, then they belong inside a broader, older history of civilization. The distinction is not just academic, it changes the emotional story of humanity. It suggests that civilization did not begin the moment a king appeared. It began in the long effort to make many lives cohere. The people of Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, and their related worlds did not build pyramids, but they built obligations. They did not write laws, but they repeated customs. They did not carve royal victories, but they carved animals and shaped spaces where communities gathered. They did not leave palace archives, but they left houses filled with ancestors and floors renewed by generations. Their world was not simple because it lacked kings. It was complex in a way kings later overshadowed, and perhaps that is why it feels forgotten. Later civilizations are loud. They speak in monuments, lists, battles, names, and claims of eternity. This older world speaks quietly, through plaster dust and buried bones, through stone tools and roof entries, through pillars deliberately hidden under rubble. It does not tell us what to call it. It forces us to reconsider the categories themselves, before Egypt, before the first written boast of power. There were societies learning how to become large without becoming states, how to remember without writing, and how to build a world in which authority could exist without a throne. Even in a world without kings or written ledgers, things still move. Stone moves, ideas move, people move, and with them travels a network that stretches far beyond any single settlement. The forgotten world before Egypt is not a collection of isolated villages quietly inventing life on their own. It is threaded together by exchange routes that carry materials, techniques, and meanings across hundreds of kilometers. These are not roads in the later sense, paved or marked by states. They are paths worn into memory, reinforced by repetition, and maintained by relationships between communities who recognize one another across distance. One of the clearest signs of this network is obsidian, the dark volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges and reflective surface. Obsidian does not occur everywhere. It originates in specific volcanic regions, particularly in Anatolia, yet blades and flakes made from it appear far from those sources. At sites like Çatalhöyük, obsidian tools are common, and chemical analysis can trace them back to particular volcanic outcrops. This means people were either travelling long distances to obtain it, or receiving it through chains of exchange. Either way, the material is evidence of connection. A blade in a house carries the story of a landscape far beyond the immediate horizon. Obsidian is not the only thing that moves. Marine shells appear inland, carried from distant coasts. Pigments, including red ochre, travel between regions. Stone types unsuitable for local geology are found in places where they do not belong. Even architectural ideas, such as building forms or symbolic motifs, seem to spread across wide areas. The evidence remains incomplete, but patterns repeat often enough to suggest shared knowledge. No single explanation fully accounts for how these networks operated, whether through direct journeys, seasonal gatherings, gift exchange, or more structured trade, but the movement itself is undeniable. Exchange in this world is not purely economic, it is social. A valuable object is not just a tool, it is a link between people. To receive obsidian from a distant source may mean maintaining a relationship with those who control access to it. To give shells or crafted goods in return may create obligation, alliance, or recognition. These exchanges can be ceremonial as much as practical. In societies without written contracts, objects can stand in for memory, a blade, a bead. A pigment can embody a relationship that must be remembered and renewed. Travel itself becomes part of the structure. People who move between regions carry more than goods. They carry stories about landscapes, knowledge of routes, awareness of other communities, and perhaps ritual practices learned elsewhere. A person arriving from a distant valley brings news, techniques, and expectations. Over time, this movement knits together a cultural horizon. Communities may never meet all others in the network, but they participate in a shared system of recognition. Certain materials are valued across distance, certain symbols are understood, certain practices echo one another. This broader horizon also helps explain how ideas spread without writing. If a particular way of building, carving, or organizing space proves meaningful or effective, it can travel through observation and imitation. A visitor sees a structure, returns home, and adapts the idea. A marriage between groups carries knowledge across regions. A shared ritual at a gathering introduces new forms to participants who take them back to their own communities. Over generations, these movements create patterns that archaeologists can detect as similarities between sites. These similarities are not proof of a centralized authority, but they do show a shared cultural language. There is a quiet sophistication in how these networks operate. Without formal markets, currency, or standardized contracts, exchange relies on trust, reputation, and repeated interaction. A group known for producing fine tools or hosting generous feasts gains prestige. Others seek connection with them. Relationships are maintained through visits, gifts, and mutual obligations. Failure to reciprocate can damage standing, just as generosity can enhance it. In this way, exchange becomes a form of social currency. It binds communities into systems that extend far beyond immediate survival. One lesser-known detail is how these networks may have influenced innovation. Access to different materials and ideas can accelerate change. A community exposed to new tool types, building methods, or symbolic forms may incorporate them into local traditions. This does not mean that innovation always spreads smoothly. Some ideas are resisted, others transformed, others forgotten. But the existence of wide exchange networks creates the possibility of shared development. Farming techniques, herding practices, and architectural forms may have moved along these same routes, adapting as they went. The landscape itself shapes these movements. Rivers guide travel. Mountain passes channel movement through specific routes. Plains allow easier passage but expose travelers to risk. Seasonal changes affect when journeys are possible. Knowledge of these patterns becomes part of cultural memory. A group that knows when to cross a river, where to find water, and which paths avoid danger holds valuable information. This knowledge can be exchanged, protected, or used to maintain advantage. Conflict may also play a role in these networks. Exchange does not eliminate competition. Valuable resources attract interest, and control over them can create tension. While evidence for organized warfare in this period is limited and often debated, localized conflict likely occurred, yet even conflict can reinforce networks by defining boundaries and relationships. Groups that compete may still trade, marry, or share rituals under certain conditions. The line between ally and rival can shift over time. In this context, the idea of a super-civilization becomes more nuanced. There is no single center directing these exchanges, no unified political structure overseeing the movement of goods and ideas. Instead, there is a web of communities linked by relationships that are both practical and symbolic. It is a civilization not of empire, but of connection. Its strength lies in its flexibility. If one route fails, another can be used. If one settlement declines, others persist. The network adapts. This adaptability may be one reason the system endures long enough to influence later developments. When more formal trade systems emerge in the Bronze Age, they do not appear from nothing. They build on older patterns of movement and exchange. The paths of obsidian may foreshadow the paths of metals, textiles, and other goods. The habit of maintaining distant relationships becomes a foundation for more complex economic systems. Yet the earlier network remains distinct in its character. It is personal, relational, and embedded in daily life. It does not require written records because it is sustained by memory and practice. It does not require centralized authority because it is maintained through mutual interest and shared culture. It is both fragile and resilient, capable of breaking under pressure, but also capable of reforming in new configurations. Standing within this web, a person in a Neolithic settlement would not feel isolated. Even without maps or written descriptions, they would know that their world extended beyond the visible horizon. Objects in their home would testify to distant places. Visitors would bring news and novelty. Rituals might echo practices from other regions. The sense of belonging would stretch outward, connecting local life to a wider human landscape. This wider landscape is what makes the forgotten world before Egypt feel so expansive. It is not defined by borders or capitals, but by movement and relationship. It is a civilization of paths rather than walls, of exchange rather than conquest. Its traces are subtle, but they reveal a humanity already capable of thinking beyond immediate surroundings, already engaged in a network of shared existence. And as these connections deepen, they carry with them not only tools and materials, but ideas about life, death, power, and meaning. The obsidian blade in a house is not just a cutting edge, it is a fragment of a larger world, a sign that even in this early age, humans are weaving themselves into patterns that will shape the future. The roads of stone and memory are already in place, long before the first written map tries to capture them. The objects and images that survive from this world carry a strange double quality. They feel immediate, almost intimate, because they come from houses, burials, walls, and stones touched by human hands. Yet they also feel remote, because their meanings are partly sealed away. A bull's horn set into a plastered room, a vulture painted near human bodies, a skull removed and handled after burial, a small figurine shaped with care, a snake carved into limestone. Each seems to say that these people lived inside a dense symbolic universe, but the language of that universe is lost. What remains is not silence exactly. It is a murmur without a dictionary. Animals stand at the center of this murmur. At Göbekli Tepe, the carved world is crowded with wild creatures. At Çatalhöyük, bulls, leopards, vultures, and other animals appear on walls and in installations. Across the early Neolithic Near East, animal imagery does not simply decorate life, it gives life a charged frame. The bull, especially the wild aurochs, seems to carry tremendous force. It is not only meat, it is size, danger, fertility, strength, and perhaps a memory of the wild world that farming communities are beginning to control but have not yet subdued. To place bull horns inside a house is to bring something untamed into domestic space, to make danger present and contained at the same time. The vulture belongs to another zone of meaning, one closer to death and transformation. In several prehistoric contexts, large birds have been linked by scholars to mortuary practices, perhaps because scavenging birds consume flesh and leave bones behind, turning bodies into something clean, portable, ancestral. At Çatalhöyük, vultures appear in painted scenes that have often been interpreted in relation to death, though the exact meaning remains debated. At Göbekli Tepe, birds and other creatures may have carried similar associations, but certainty is impossible. The evidence remains incomplete, and symbols can change from place to place. Still, the repeated presence of birds, skulls, and unusual body treatment suggests that death was not simply an ending. It was a process managed through ritual. Skulls are among the most powerful clues. In many early Neolithic communities, bodies are buried beneath floors, and in some cases skulls are later removed, plastered, painted, displayed, or reburied. This so-called skull cult is not a single cult in the modern sense, and it should not be imagined as one uniform religion. But it does reveal a widespread concern with the head as a special seat of identity, ancestry, or presence. A face remade in plaster may have allowed the dead to remain socially visible. A skull kept apart from the body may have marked lineage, memory, power, or belonging. Scholars still debate whether these practices honoured ancestors, legitimised household claims, created ritual objects, or expressed beliefs about life after death. No single explanation fully accounts for them. The closeness of the dead to the living changes the feel of settlement. In later societies, cemeteries often lie outside the spaces of daily life. In these early villages, the dead may rest beneath platforms where people sleep, cook, sit, and work. This is not neglect, it is intimacy. The floor becomes a boundary between worlds, thin enough that ancestry remains present. Every resurfacing of plaster covers the past but does not erase it. Every rebuilding of a house renews a relationship with those underneath. A household is therefore not just a group of living people, it is a layered community of the living, the dead, and the remembered. The famous figurines add another layer, though they have often been made to carry more certainty than they can bear. Some are female, some animal, some ambiguous, some deliberately simple, some carefully shaped. Popular accounts once treated certain seated female figures from Çatalhöyük as proof of a great mother goddess religion. That interpretation remains influential in imagination, but modern archaeology is more cautious. The figurines appear in varied contexts, and female forms are only one part of a broader symbolic repertoire. They may relate to fertility, age, status, myth, teaching, play, ritual, household identity, or something else entirely. What survives in the record suggests symbolic richness, not a single easy doctrine. This is important because the mystery of these societies is not solved by replacing one simple story with another. It is tempting to say that before male kings and warrior states, there was a peaceful goddess civilization. It is equally tempting to say that every bullhorn and hunting image proves a harsh world of male power. The archaeological record resists both extremes. It shows bodies, animals, houses, tools, food, death, a memory intertwined in ways that do not map neatly onto modern categories. The people of this world did not arrange their beliefs for the convenience of future viewers. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars deepen the puzzle. Some of the central pillars show arms and hands carved along their sides, with belts or loincloth-like details near the lower front. This strongly suggests that at least some pillars represent stylized human or human-like beings. But they have no carved faces. Their heads are abstract crossbars, their bodies reduced to stone presence. They may represent ancestors, spirits, mythic figures, or beings beyond ordinary humanity. Their facelessness may be accidental to the style, or it may be essential. A face fixes identity. These stones seem to hold identity open. Around them, animals appear almost as forces. Some carvings show creatures in motion, others in confrontation or procession. Snakes slide across surfaces with unnerving simplicity. Foxes appear often, their long bodies and pointed faces suggesting cunning or liminality, though that is modern inference. Scorpions, boars, and birds occupy the same symbolic field. The result is not a peaceful nature scene. It is a charged assembly. The enclosures may have staged a relationship between human-like pillars and animal powers, between the social and the wild, between the living community and the unseen. One lesser-known aspect of early Neolithic symbolism is how often the body itself seems to be taken apart, reassembled, or transformed. Skulls are removed, bodies are flexed in burials. Plaster creates new surfaces over old remains. Figurines may exaggerate certain features and ignore others. Pillars reduce humans to arms, hands, and belts without faces. Vultures and other creatures may suggest exposure, consumption, or transformation of flesh. This does not prove a single belief about the soul, but it suggests that identity was not thought of as a simple, sealed individual unit. Bodies could become ancestors, symbols, objects of memory, or parts of a house's continuing life. The bull, the goddess, and the dead therefore should not be treated as separate topics. They belong to the same deep concern how life continues through danger, reproduction, memory, and loss. Farming societies are intensely aware of cycles. Seeds die and return. Animals breed and are slaughtered. Houses decay and are rebuilt. Bodies are buried and remembered. The wild must be killed, honored, feared, or brought under control. The human community survives by managing transformations it never fully commands. Ritual gives form to that uncertainty. This symbolic world may also have helped hold communities together. Shared images create shared expectations. If everyone recognizes the power of the bull, the importance of ancestors, or the danger of certain animals, then ritual can organize collective emotion. It can make cooperation feel necessary. It can turn a house into a lineage, a feast into an alliance, a burial into a claim, a monument into a memory shared by many groups. In societies without writing, symbols are not decoration. They are infrastructure. Still, these symbols do not speak plainly. Archaeologists can describe their contexts, compare patterns, and build cautious interpretations, but the final meanings remain unreachable. This uncertainty is not a failure, it is part of the truth. The people before Egypt lived in a world as mentally rich as any later civilization, but they did not leave explanatory texts. Their images survive without captions. Their rituals survive as traces after the words, songs, gestures, and emotions have vanished. And perhaps that is why they remain so compelling. A palace tells us who ruled. A tablet tells us what was counted. A royal inscription tells us what a king wanted remembered. But a skull beneath a floor, a bullhorn in plaster, a faceless pillar among carved animals, and a vulture painted above human forms ask something harder. They ask us to imagine a civilization of meaning before written meaning. A world where the dead were close, animals were powerful, houses were alive with memory. And the boundary between human society and the wild was still being negotiated every day. The greatest wall between this world and us is not stone, soil, or time. It is the absence of writing. Egypt leaves names. Sumer leaves accounts. Later kings carve their victories into walls and press their anxieties into clay. Even when they lie, exaggerate, or speak only for the powerful, they give historians something direct to confront. The communities before Egypt do not do this. They leave no king lists, no hymns, no tax records, no foundation inscriptions, no myths written in their own language, no simple sentence explaining why a pillar was raised or why a skull was plastered. Their world survives, but it survives without its voice. This absence creates a particular kind of mystery. It does not mean these people lacked language, memory, law, poetry, or story. They almost certainly possessed all of these in oral form. They named places, ancestors, animals, seasons, tools, dangers, obligations, and unseen powers. They told stories around fires and inside houses. They taught children through speech, gesture, rhythm, and repetition. They likely had rich vocabularies for plants, animals, kinship, weather, stone, and ritual. But spoken words vanish unless they are carried forward or fixed into durable form. Here, they were not fixed. The result is not a silent people, but a silenced record. Archaeology, therefore, has to work indirectly. A written text can say that a ruler built a temple for a god, though even then the claim must be questioned. A prehistoric enclosure can only show that people built, used, altered, and buried it. A tablet can list grain rations. A storage pit can only imply food management. A myth can describe a god in words. A carved animal can only suggest symbolic force. This is why certainty is harder in the pre-literate world. The evidence remains incomplete not because archaeologists are careless, but because the surviving material was never designed to answer modern questions. And yet absence is not emptiness. Soil can speak in its own way. Seeds reveal what people ate and cultivated. Animal bones reveal hunting, herding, feasting, and butchery. teeth reveal diet, stress, and movement. Stone tools reveal skill, exchange, and work habits. Isotopes in bones can suggest where people grew up or what food sustained them. Residues in vessels or on tools can hint at processing, cooking, or pigments. House floors reveal rebuilding. Burials reveal patterns of care, difference, and memory. The problem is not that there is no evidence. The problem is that the evidence speaks in probabilities rather than sentences. This can make the world before writing vulnerable to fantasy. Where texts are absent, imagination rushes in. Popular theories often claim that sites like Göbekli Tepe encode lost astronomical knowledge, preserve messages from a destroyed civilization, or prove contact with advanced outsiders. Some claims begin with real puzzles, but then move far beyond the evidence. Mainstream archaeology does not reject mystery. It depends on mystery, but it requires that interpretation remain tied to what can actually be shown. A carved animal may align with a belief system. It does not automatically become a star map. A monumental enclosure may show surprising organization. It does not prove a vanished global empire. The temptation is understandable because the gap is so large. When later civilizations write, they make themselves feel closer. A Sumerian scribe complaining, counting, or praising a god seems recognizably human. A faceless T-shaped pillar does not offer that kind of intimacy. It is human-made, yet it withholds the human sentence. The mind wants to complete the silence with the story. The careful task is to build stories that remain honest about uncertainty. Scholars still debate the meanings of many symbols, the social roles of special buildings, and the precise relationship between ritual and farming. Those debates are not weaknesses. They are the discipline's way of refusing to pretend that guesses are facts. Writing also changes what a society can become. Once information can be stored outside living memory, administration expands. Debts can be recorded, land can be measured, rations can be counted, names can be preserved across generations without relying only on oral tradition. Myths can travel in more stable form. Law can be formalized. Power can become more abstract because records allow rulers and institutions to reach beyond face-to-face relationships. This does not mean writing creates civilization by itself, but it transforms the scale and durability of certain kinds of authority. The pre-Egyptian world shows complexity before that transformation, which is exactly why it is so important. Before writing, memory has to live differently. It lives in bodies, songs, gestures, roots, architecture, and repeated acts. A ritual performed each season is a record. A house rebuilt over the bones of ancestors is a record. A pillar carved in a traditional form is a record. A path to an obsidian source is a record. These records are durable in practice but fragile in meaning. They can last for centuries as actions, then vanish when the practice stops. Archaeology finds the shell of memory after the living content has gone. One lesser-known problem is that even when symbols repeat, repetition does not guarantee stable meaning. A bullhorn in one house may not mean exactly what a bull image in another settlement means. A skull practice may shift over time from ancestor care to status display, from household memory to communal ritual, or from one belief to another. Without texts, archaeologists must resist flattening centuries into one interpretation. The Neolithic was not a single moment. It was thousands of years of change. Traditions can persist while meanings drift beneath them. This is especially important when comparing the prehistoric Near East to later Egypt or Sumer. It is tempting to trace a straight line from Neolithic skulls to later ancestor cults, from bull symbolism to Egyptian sacred cattle, from ritual buildings to temples, from village storage to temple economies. Some broad continuities may exist at the level of human concerns: death, fertility, animals, grain, water, power, memory. But direct lines are hard to prove. The evidence allows cautious connections, not simple inheritance. Later civilizations did not copy a preserved manual from Göbekli Tepe. They emerge from long regional histories in which ideas changed, moved, disappeared, and reappeared in new forms. The missing writing also affects the people themselves. We do not know their personal names. No child, builder, hunter, elder, or ritual specialist steps forward individually. They appear collectively as communities and patterns. This can make them seem anonymous. But anonymity should not be mistaken for sameness. Every plastered wall was made by particular hands. Every burial involved particular grief. Every journey for obsidian required particular feet, risks, and decisions. The lack of names is our loss, not proof that individuality was absent. There is a certain humility in studying such a world. Later civilizations often tell us what they want us to believe. This earlier world does not. It forces attention onto ordinary material reality, the density of floors, the angle of a wall, the cut marks on bone, the source of stone, the pollen trapped in sediment, the wear on a tooth. It asks us to build history from traces that no one arranged as a message to us. In that sense, it may be more honest than royal history. It does not boast. It simply remains. And because it remains without writing, it changes the meaning of civilization's beginning. If civilization is defined by texts, then this world stands outside it. But if civilization includes the building of shared memory, the organization of labor, the creation of symbolic landscapes, and the management of food, death, and belonging, then writing is not the beginning. It is one powerful development within a much older human project. The forgotten super-civilization before Egypt is forgotten partly because it did not write itself into history. But the ground remembered, the stones remembered, the houses remembered, and now, slowly, their wordless archive is being read. A civilization without palaces does not always fall with smoke on the horizon. Sometimes it fades by changing shape. The great ritual enclosures are buried. The crowded house worlds are gradually abandoned. The old symbols lose force, or move elsewhere, or become unrecognizable inside new ways of living. There is no single day when the forgotten world before Egypt ends. No final king is defeated. No last inscription records disaster. Instead, archaeology finds shifting settlement patterns, altered building traditions, changing diets, new movements of people, and places once full of meaning left to weather, collapse, or be covered by their own debris. Collapse here is not a dramatic curtain drop. It is transformation with ruins so quiet that, for thousands of years, almost no one knows to look for them. Göbekli Tepe offers the strangest version of this ending because its monumental spaces are not merely deserted, they are deliberately filled. The enclosures, once open to bodies, ceremonies, carved animals, and whatever powerful presence the central pillars held, are packed with rubble, soil, bones, broken stone, and debris. This act takes labor. It is not the same as forgetting. It may be a closing rite, a controlled burial of sacred architecture, a way to preserve dangerous or exhausted power, or simply part of a tradition of retiring old structures. Scholars still debate the meaning, and the evidence remains incomplete. but the burial itself matters. The builders or their descendants choose to cover what earlier generations raised. Their ending is an action. Why would a community bury its own monument? One possibility is that sacred places had life cycles. A building might be born, used, renewed, and then ritually closed, much as houses in later settlements could be rebuilt over earlier houses. Another possibility is social change. If the gatherings that sustain the enclosures became less central, the old spaces may have lost their purpose. As people settled more permanently, ritual may have moved from open hilltop enclosures into villages, houses, and smaller special buildings. The world of seasonal congregation may have given way to a world of rooted households. The sacred did not vanish. It changed address. Climate may also have played a role, but carefully. It is tempting to make climate the master key to every prehistoric transformation. Drought appears, people move, civilization collapses. The real pattern is usually more tangled. The early Holocene brought warmer conditions, but also local fluctuations. Over centuries, changing rainfall, vegetation, and resource pressures would have affected where people could farm, herd, hunt, and gather. Communities dependent on particular combinations of wild and cultivated resources may have had to adjust. No single explanation fully accounts for the fading of early megasites, but environmental change likely formed part of the pressure surrounding social and economic transformation. As farming intensifies, the old ritual centers may become less necessary. A community tied to fields cannot gather and disperse in the same way as highly mobile groups. Crops require attention at particular times. Herds require management. Houses accumulate possessions and dead ancestors. Land claims become more important. The center of gravity shifts from the distant ceremonial ridge to the village, the field, the herd, the household, and the local dead. Monumental gathering places may have been products of a world still balanced between mobility and settlement. Once that balance tips, their social foundation weakens. Çatalhöyük, too, eventually declines. Its mound preserves long centuries of occupation, but the dense pattern of life does not last forever. People move away, settlement shifts, and the old house-based system changes. Here again, the reasons are debated. Environmental stress, changing water availability, soil exhaustion, disease, social tension, altered trade routes, and new forms of economy may all have contributed. The evidence suggests not a single catastrophe, but gradual reorganization. A community that survives for centuries can still reach a point where its traditions no longer solve the problems they once solved. This is one of the deepest lessons of early civilization. Stability creates its own burdens. Dense settlement allows continuity, but it also concentrates waste, disease, conflict, and dependence. Farming supports larger populations, but it can narrow diets and tie people to risky harvests. Stored food creates security, but also inequality and theft. Ancestral houses create belonging, but they can also trap people inside inherited obligations. Ritual systems bind communities, but they may fail when circumstances change. Collapse is often not the opposite of success. It is what happens when successful systems meet conditions they were not built to absorb. The archaeological record captures this in fragments. Houses become less carefully maintained. Occupation shifts across a mound. Certain symbolic practices diminish. New pottery traditions appear in later periods. Settlement spreads into different ecological zones. Herding becomes more important in some regions. Communities become smaller in one place and larger in another. None of this looks like the fall of Rome. It looks like people making decisions, leaving, rebuilding, marrying into other groups, adopting new tools, abandoning old rites, taking animals farther out, planting elsewhere, and letting some places fall behind them. There is a human sadness in this, though it should not be overstated. Abandonment does not always mean despair. People leave places for practical reasons, hopeful reasons, forced reasons, or ordinary reasons. A settlement may be remembered for generations after it is no longer occupied. A buried enclosure may remain a landmark even if its original meaning is lost. Children may hear stories of an old mound or a forbidden hill without knowing the full history beneath it. What modern archaeology calls collapse may have felt to those living through it like adaptation. Still, something does end. The great pre-pottery Neolithic symbolic world, with its monumental T-pillars, intense animal imagery, and particular ritual forms, does not continue unchanged into later millennia. The dense house world of Çatalhöyük also belongs to a specific moment, not an eternal model. Later villages develop new forms, pottery becomes widespread, farming systems expand, regional identities shift. Eventually, metallurgy, long-distance trade, fortified settlements, administrative practices, and social hierarchies grow more visible. The old world is not destroyed so much as buried under the successions it helped make possible. One lesser-known consequence of this transformation is that memory itself becomes vulnerable. When a society has no writing, the survival of its past depends on living practice. If the ritual is no longer performed, the meaning thins. If the house is abandoned, the ancestors beneath it lose their immediate social place. If the path to the old enclosure is no longer walked, the story attached to it frays. The material remains can last, but the explanation dies. By the time later civilizations rise, the people of Göbekli Tepe and early Çatalhöyük may already be as mysterious to their successors as they are to us. And yet their disappearance is not total. Their legacy survives in habits rather than names. The domesticated plants and animals they helped bring into human life continue to spread. The experience of living in villages continues. The practice of building special spaces continues. The idea that places can hold ancestors continues. The use of exchange networks continues. The management of surplus, land, labor, and ritual continues. Later civilizations may not remember the early builders, but they inherit parts of the world those builders created. This is the quiet way deep history works. It rarely preserves credit. The people who make the first experiments are often forgotten by the societies that benefit from them. Egypt will later stand in stone and gold, but its possibility belongs to a much older human transformation across the Near East and beyond. The first farmers, builders, herders, traders, and ritual communities do not become famous, they become foundations. So the collapse without ruins is also a survival without names. The hilltop enclosures are sealed, the house mounds erode, the old pathways shift, but the human experiment continues, now moving toward larger villages, stronger inequalities, broader exchange, and eventually the first true cities. What fades in one form returns in another. The forgotten world before Egypt does not vanish like a light extinguished. It sinks into the ground like water, feeding roots that will break the surface somewhere else. By the time Sumerian cities rise from the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia and Egypt begins gathering itself along the Nile, the old world of T-shaped pillars, roof-entered houses, and skulls beneath floors is already ancient. Its monuments are buried. Its villages have changed or emptied. Its names, if names were once attached to its places and ancestors, are gone. Yet history rarely begins where written history begins. Beneath the first dynasties and the first city-states lies a deeper inheritance, plants already domesticated, animals already managed, settled life already tested, exchange already familiar, ritual architecture already imagined, and human communities already trained in the difficult art of living with surplus memory and obligation. This is where the connection to Egypt must be handled with care. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not build Egypt. Çatalhöyük was not a secret Egyptian prototype. There is no evidence for a single lost master civilization handing blueprints to later kings on the Nile. The evidence remains incomplete, and popular claims about hidden prehistoric empires often leap across thousands of years without enough proof. But the absence of a direct line does not mean there is no relationship at all. Later civilizations emerge from a world already transformed by Neolithic innovations, many of which first developed across the Near East before spreading, adapting, and becoming local in new landscapes. Sumer is closer geographically to some of these deep roots. In southern Mesopotamia, the later urban world depends on farming, herding, irrigation, temple organization, craft specialization, and trade. The earlier southern cities do not appear until long after northern villages and ritual centers have already explored settled life. The alluvial south is a demanding place. It is rich, but not simple. Its rivers shift. Floods can be destructive. Rainfall is limited. And agriculture eventually requires coordinated water management. The people who build Sumer inherit crops, animals, technologies, and social habits shaped over millennia. They transform them into something new: cities with temples, scribes, rulers, labor systems, and written accounts. But the raw human experiment is older. Egypt follows a different path, tied to the Nile's extraordinary rhythm. The river floods, retreats, and leaves behind fertile silt. Deserts on either side create boundaries as well as roots. Communities along the Nile gradually develop farming economies, regional cultures, elite burial practices, craft traditions, and eventually political unification. Egypt's rise is not simply borrowed from the Near East. It has its own African context, its own landscapes, its own long prehistoric development. Yet some elements of the Neolithic package, including domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats, reach Egypt through wider networks of movement and exchange. Egypt becomes Egypt in Egypt, but it does so in a world already changed by older transformations. The echo is therefore not a straight line of kingship, but a diffusion of possibilities. Once humans learn to cultivate grain, store food, herd animals, live in permanent settlements, build symbolic architecture, and maintain long-distance exchange. Those possibilities can travel and recombine. In one region they produce house-centered settlements. In another they produce irrigation villages. In another they produce temple economies. In another they produce royal tombs. The same deep ingredients do not create identical outcomes. Landscape, climate, population, conflict, belief, and chance shape the final form. A surprising continuity lies in the power of sacred architecture. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures are not temples in the later Mesopotamian or Egyptian sense, but they show that special buildings could gather labor and meaning long before the first state temple. Later temples become economic engines, administrative centers, and houses of gods. Earlier ritual buildings may have been more fluid, tied to feasting, ancestors, animals, and communal identity. Still, The underlying principle remains: profound architecture can make invisible order visible. It can turn belief into space. It can organize people by giving them something larger than the household to serve. Another echo lies in the treatment of the dead. Egypt will later become famous for tombs, mummification, ancestor memory, and the immense political theology of death. The Neolithic Near East does not anticipate that system directly, and it would be misleading to treat plastered skulls as early pharaohs in miniature. But the concern with the dead as socially active beings is much older than Egypt. The dead are buried beneath floors, revisited, sometimes altered, sometimes made present again. What survives in the record suggests that long before pyramids, humans are already using bodies, bones, houses, and monuments to negotiate continuity. Egypt gives death a state theology. Earlier communities give it a household and communal presence. The bull offers another cautious echo. In prehistoric Anatolia and the Near East, wild cattle imagery carries power. At Çatalhöyük, horns and bull symbolism fill domestic spaces with the force of the wild. In later Mesopotamia and Egypt, cattle and bulls continue to carry royal, divine, and cosmic associations. This does not prove an unbroken cult stretching across millennia. Symbols can arise repeatedly because humans repeatedly encounter the same realities: strength, fertility, danger, wealth, blood, meat, and the awe of large animals. But it does suggest that later civilizations did not invent symbolic power from nothing. They inherited and reshaped a very old human vocabulary. Writing changes everything when it arrives. In Sumer, writing grows first from practical accounting systems, from the need to record goods, labor, and transactions. Soon it expands into names, myths, hymns, school exercises, royal inscriptions, and literature. Egypt develops its own writing system in the context of administration, kingship, ritual, and display. Once writing appears, the older world is pushed behind a curtain. History seems to begin with those who can speak to us directly. But writing is not the first act of civilization. It is a late and powerful instrument built atop older habits of counting, storing, remembering, and organizing. The administrative mind may have deep roots in Neolithic storage and exchange. A granary does not need writing to create questions of measurement and control. A herd does not need writing to create ideas of ownership and increase. A feast does not need writing to create obligation and debt. A settlement does not need writing to create disputes over space and inheritance. Writing makes these things more durable and scalable, but it does not invent the social problems behind them. The first scribes formalize pressures that had been building for thousands of years. This is why the forgotten world before Egypt matters so much. It shifts attention from the spectacular beginning of states to the quieter beginning of systems. The great transformation is not only that kings appear, it is that humans become increasingly tied to fields, herds, houses, surplus, ancestors, exchange, and permanent places. Once that happens, certain futures become possible, though never inevitable. A village can remain a village. A ritual center can be buried. A settlement can disperse. But under the right pressures, these older experiments can intensify into cities and states. Sumer and Egypt are therefore not the first sparks in darkness. They are bonfires built from embers already glowing across the prehistoric world. Their achievements are real and enormous, but they stand on ground prepared by people whose names were never written. The farmers who selected grain, the builders who shaped limestone, the households that kept ancestors beneath floors, the travellers who carried obsidian, the communities that learned to gather without kings. All of them belong to the deep prehistory of civilization, and the echoes are still uneven. Some early practices vanish completely, others survive only as transformed habits. The T-shaped pillars do not become pyramids, the roof-entered houses do not become Egyptian temples, the skull rituals do not become Sumerian tablets. History is not a chain of identical links. It is more like a river system, with streams disappearing underground, re-emerging elsewhere, merging, splitting, and changing names. By the time the Nile and the lower Mesopotamian plains produced their famous civilizations, the older waters have travelled far from their sources. So when the question is asked, what came before Egypt? The answer is not one hidden kingdom. It is a vast unfinished world of experiments. It is people learning to stay. It is people learning to build for the unseen. It is people learning that grain could be stored, animals could be managed, houses could hold ancestors, and distant communities could be tied together by exchange. Egypt and Sumer will give these experiments new forms, grander and more legible. But the first great human crossing has already happened, quietly, in villages, hills, fields, and ritual spaces long since buried. The phrase forgotten super-civilization is powerful because it points toward a real astonishment, but it also stands near a dangerous edge. On one side is the evidence prehistoric communities in Anatolia and the wider Near East were far more organized, symbolic, connected, and architecturally ambitious than older models allowed. On the other side is the temptation to turn that evidence into a vanished empire, a lost master race, a secret technological society, or an ancient world government hidden beneath the soil. The first side is archaeology, the second is mostly modern hunger wearing ancient clothing. The real prehistoric world does not need exaggeration to be remarkable. Göbekli Tepe is already astonishing without aliens, Atlantis, or impossible machines. Çatalhöyük is already strange enough without being forced into a fantasy of perfect peace or secret wisdom. The early Neolithic is already revolutionary without imagining that all later civilizations copied from a single lost source. What survives in the record suggests a broad cultural horizon of communities capable of organized labor, shared ritual, exchange, settlement, symbolic art, and long-term memory. That is not a small claim. It is one of the most important revisions in the story of civilization's origins. The problem begins when mystery is treated as proof. A carved animal whose meaning is unknown becomes, in some accounts, a coded astronomical message. A buried enclosure becomes evidence of a catastrophe wiping out an advanced civilization. A lack of writing becomes proof that the true records were destroyed. A gap in knowledge becomes a doorway through which anything can enter. This is not how the past works. Uncertainty is not empty space. It has boundaries. Scholars still debate many details. But debate happens inside evidence dates, tools, bones, architecture, sediment, plant remains, and comparisons between sites. The fact that something is not fully explained does not mean every explanation is equally likely. There are good reasons people reach for grander myths. Modern civilization feels fragile, and ancient mysteries offer a mirror. The idea of a forgotten super-civilization destroyed before history began is emotionally satisfying. It warns that human achievement can vanish. It suggests that the past hides knowledge modern people have lost. It gives deep time a dramatic shape. But the evidence for the early Neolithic tells a subtler and perhaps more unsettling story. Civilization was not born once in a blaze of lost brilliance. It was built slowly, unevenly, by communities experimenting with food, ritual, houses, animals, trade, and memory. Its origins are not less mysterious for being gradual. They are more human. The word super can still have meaning if it is rescued from fantasy. These societies were super not because they were technologically superior to later Egypt, but because they exceeded the expectations once placed on them. They stood before writing yet built monumental spaces. They lived before states yet organized collective labor. They lacked cities in the later sense yet sustained large communities. They had no royal archives yet maintained traditions across generations. They forced archaeology to widen its definition of complexity. In that sense, they were a super civilization of the threshold, not an empire, but a network of extraordinary human possibility. This distinction matters because false mystery can erase real achievement. When people say ancient monuments must have required lost technology, they often diminish the intelligence of the humans who actually built them. Stone tools are not stupidity. Oral societies are not empty minds. Hunter-gatherers are not failed farmers. Early villages are not half-formed versions of urban people. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not need bronze saws or forgotten engines to make their work meaningful. Their achievement lies in what they accomplished with the materials, bodies, knowledge, and social worlds they had. A lesser-known but crucial part of archaeology is how much it depends on ordinary evidence rather than spectacular objects. A seed fragment can change a timeline. A microscopic polish on a tool can reveal how it was used. Chemical signatures can trace obsidian to a volcanic source. Tooth enamel can suggest childhood movement. Layers of plaster can show how often a house was renewed. Cut marks on bone can distinguish butchery from ritual treatment or later disturbance. These details do not make dramatic headlines, but they are the reason serious interpretations can be built at all. The mystery becomes stronger when it rests on such small, stubborn facts. At the same time, mainstream archaeology is not a closed wall against wonder. It changes when evidence demands it. Göbekli Tepe itself helped change assumptions about monumental architecture and hunter-gatherer organization. New excavations in the Taş Tepeler region continue to complicate the picture. Karahan Tepe and other sites suggest a wider symbolic landscape than once known. Genetic studies, climate research, residue analysis, and improved dating methods keep refining the story. The evidence remains incomplete, but incompleteness is not stagnation. The past is still actively being discovered. This is why the debate over the pre-Egyptian world is not between mystery and science. Science is the reason the mystery exists in its sharpest form. Without careful excavation, Göbekli Tepe might remain just a hill. Without dating methods, its age would not shock anyone. Without plant and animal studies, the relationship between ritual, settlement, and farming would be vague. Without comparative archaeology, Çatalhöyük would be only a strange mound rather than part of a wider transformation. The disciplined record does not drain the wonder away. It gives the wonder its depth. Popular unsupported theories often claim that there must have been a single advanced source because similar symbols or monuments appear in different parts of the world. But human societies can develop similar answers to similar problems without direct inheritance. Many communities face death, hunger, seasonal change, dangerous animals, the need for cooperation, and the power of ancestors. Many discover that stone endures, that ritual organizes emotion, that food surplus creates authority, that special places gather memory. Similarity can come from contact, but it can also come from shared human conditions. The task is to distinguish the two, not to assume one grand explanation. In the case of the early Near East, Contact is real, but it is regional and material, not global and imperial. Obsidian, shells, tools, ideas, and perhaps ritual forms move across large distances. Shared architectural traditions appear. Communities participate in overlapping worlds. But nothing in the evidence requires a unified prehistoric state ruling from a lost capital. The network is impressive precisely because it operates without that. It shows that human connection can be wide before political unification. A web is not weaker history than an empire. It may be more revealing. There is also a danger in imagining civilization only as something that must lead to us. The people of this deep past were not rehearsing for Egypt. They were not incomplete Sumerians. They were living their own present, solving their own problems, honouring their own dead, fearing their own animals, walking their own routes. Their importance does not depend only on what came after. They matter because they show a form of human life that was complex, creative, and different. To treat them merely as a preface to later greatness is another way of forgetting them. The super-civilization debate therefore becomes a debate about how to respect the unknown. One form of disrespect is to dismiss early people as too simple to build, organize, or imagine. Another form is to cover them with fantasies that ignore evidence. Respect lies between those errors. It allows them to be extraordinary without making them impossible. It allows mystery without surrendering judgment. It allows uncertainty without filling every silence with myth. What remains, after the exaggerations are stripped away, is still breathtaking. Before Egypt, before Sumer, before writing, there was a world of stone enclosures, dense settlements, ancestor houses, animal powers, exchange routes, cultivated plants, managed herds, and communities learning to become large in new ways. It was not a hidden empire, but it was a foundation of empires. It was not a lost modernity, but it was a lost human achievement. Its people did not leave manifestos explaining themselves. They left something harder to misread and easier to underestimate: the material proof that civilization's roots reach into a time when the state had not yet claimed the human imagination. And that may be the real mystery. Not that an advanced civilization vanished without a trace, but that for so long the traces were there and were not understood. The stones waited, the mounds waited, the bones, seeds, tools, and plaster floors waited. They did not reveal a fantasy civilization more glamorous than Egypt. They revealed something more challenging: a world before civilization's usual symbols, already filled with civilization's deepest questions. What the stones remember is not a single answer, but a correction. They remember that civilization did not begin as suddenly as later monuments make it seem. It did not step fully formed from the Nile mud with a crown on its head, or rise from Mesopotamian clay already carrying a tablet and seal. Long before Egypt's kings learned to turn death into architecture, long before Sumer's scribes pressed numbers into wet clay, human communities were already gathering, building, farming, trading, burying, remembering, and imagining worlds larger than the individual life. The record is broken, but it is not empty. It is filled with traces of people who stood at the threshold and crossed it without knowing what future ages would call the crossing. The forgotten world before Egypt changes the story because it removes the comfort of a clean beginning. There is no single first city, first temple, first farmer, first priest, or first civilization that explains everything after it. There are many beginnings, scattered across hills, plains, valleys, and river edges. Some are monumental, like Göbekli Tepe, where stone bodies and carved animals draw people into a shared ritual landscape. Some are domestic, like Çatalhöyük, where houses become memory chambers and the dead remain close beneath the living. Some are almost invisible, a seed selected, a goat managed, a path walked again, a wall replastered, a child learning the old gestures from older hands. What survives in the records suggests that the deepest foundation of civilization was not technology alone. It was trust, repetition, memory, and the ability to make meaning durable. A stone pillar lasts because limestone resists weather, but it is raised because people agree that raising it matters. A village endures because food can be grown, but it becomes a world because ancestors, stories, obligations, and daily labor bind people to the same ground. An exchange network carries obsidian because the glass is sharp, but it also carries relationship. These early societies prove that civilization begins not only when humans control nature, but when they begin to control the relationships among themselves through shared symbols and places. The uncertainty remains. Scholars still debate the meanings of the pillars, the purpose of the enclosures, the social structure of the settlements, the role of ritual in the rise of farming, and the causes behind the fading of early centers. No single explanation fully accounts for this world. That is part of its power. It refuses to become a simple origin myth. It asks for patience. It asks to be seen not as a failed version of a later civilization, but as a different form of complexity, one that flourished before writing could preserve its own reasons. Its legacy is everywhere and nowhere. It is in the crops that later feed kingdoms. It is in the herds that become wealth. It is in the idea that certain buildings can gather a community around invisible powers. It is in the habit of burying memory into architecture. It is in the knowledge that distant groups can be linked by objects, roots, and obligations. Later civilizations make these things louder, larger, more hierarchical, and more permanent. But the first grammar is older. The first sentences were written in stone, plaster, bone, seed, and path. And so, before Egypt, there was not one forgotten super-civilization in the fantasy sense. There was something more difficult and more profound, a vast prehistoric world of experiments, connected enough to share ideas, diverse enough to resist one name, and creative enough to make civilization possible before civilization had its classic form. Its people vanished as named communities, but not as makers of history. They became the buried layer beneath everything that followed. In the end, the oldest civilizations do not disappear completely. They sink. They pass downward into soil, into habits, into crops, into animal bodies, into the shapes of houses and the memory of roads. The people who made them lose their names first. Then their languages fade. Then their rituals become gestures no one performs. Their sacred hills become ordinary hills. Their houses become mounds. Their dead sleep under floors no living family remembers. But time is not perfect at erasing. A carved fox remains. A pillar rises again into daylight. A skull waits beneath plaster. A seed, burned by accident in some ancient fire, survives long enough to tell us what hands once gathered. The landscape keeps what people cannot. And when those traces return, they do not give back the whole world. They give back enough to unsettle the story. They remind us that human beings were building meaning long before kings claimed eternity, that memory existed before writing, that architecture existed before empire, and that the first great transformations of history were made by people who never knew they were prehistoric. Somewhere on a limestone ridge, the animals still move across stone without sound. Somewhere beneath an Anatolian mound, houses still hold their dead in darkness. The Nile will rise, Egypt will glitter, Sumer will write, and empires will come calling themselves eternal. But beneath them all is an older silence, not empty, only waiting.